Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 2 o'clock session on the third day of our global dialogue. My name is Dr. Michelle Lim from the Centre of Environmental Law at Macquarie University. We've got a really exciting panel that I'm really looking forward to this afternoon on access and benefit sharing, but also access rights. But before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from unceded sovereign land of the Wadamadugo clan of the Darug Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and give thanks for the Indigenous people around the world, as well as elders past and present on the land on which I stand for sustaining country since the beginning of time. As I said, a really exciting panel this afternoon talking about some of the issues in biodiversity governance where there actually is more law. Some of the discussions we've been having over the past week are about the lack of binding legal obligations, particularly when it comes to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Not so in terms of access benefit sharing. In particular, given the Nagoya Protocol, which two of our speakers will be addressing this week with a very nice Indian perspective. And first of all, we'll have Matthew Baird and Roger Joseph Guzman, who will be framing the issue not so much in terms of the Nagoya Protocol, but more in relation to the broader issue of procedural rights. And then moving to the two papers, one from Dr. Deva Prasad, looking specifically at the agrobiodiversity issue, and also the third paper from Dr. Stelina Jolly, who is looking at the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol in the Indian context. And in this session, we've not forgotten the oceans either. In the final presentation, that's where we're hearing from Fan Ting Ling, Professor Tang Yi, and Dr. Zhang Yan-Xuedan, who have done an excellent analysis that we're just about to hear, that we'll hear as our fourth presentation in terms of the relationship between the Nagoya Protocol and the ongoing biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction negotiations. So a really, really interesting panel on a really important issue for biodiversity law. And I won't give a full introduction to all of our panelists. You'll be very familiar with this document, which I've just put in the chat box, which helps you see the breadth of expertise that have gathered here today. And without further ado, I'll go to Matthew and to Roger to talk us through this greater understanding of procedural rights when it comes to biodiversity. Matthew and Roger.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michelle. Let me just share my screen. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Yeah.
Not yet. Oh, let me try again. Okay. There.
Yes.
Is it clear?
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Michelle. My name is Roger Joseph Guzman, but please call me Rocky. I'm based in Manila, and I'll be presenting along with Matthew Baird from the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. As Dr. Michelle mentioned, we will be focusing not on access and benefit sharing per se, but it does have the access element involved. But we'll be focusing on procedural access rights and how it's been helping develop the legal regime for biodiversity conservation and focusing on the Southeast Asian region. So we'll focus on the legal frameworks in Southeast Asia, and we'll be looking at how these international legal principles on access rights and regional developments have been leading to the development of the legal regime. And we'll also be focusing on the interface between the oceans and the legal frameworks for terrestrial environmental management through these access rights, and how these contribute to the full exercise of the public of their environmental rights. So I will be presenting first, the first half of the presentation on the introduction and some of the context and some regional developments. Then I will hand to Matthew for the recommendations later on. Now, for some context on these access rights, we really have the premise of having environmental rights, substantive rights and procedural environmental rights. So the substantive rights pertain to the fundamental rights of having the right to a healthy environment or the right to a healthy ocean, which is enshrined in many jurisdictions all over the world. But there's equally as important are these procedural rights, which pertain to these the rights that enable us to exercise these substantive rights. So these include the three fundamental access rights, which are what they say the key pillars to an effective environmental governance. So these key fundamental access rights are enshrined in Principle 10, actually, of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. The first one is the access to information, where Principle 10 provides that at the national level, the public shall have appropriate access to information concerning the environment and environmental matters, which are held by public authorities. And the second access right is on public participation and making sure that there is meaningful participation by the public by making the information widely available. And the third access right is providing effective access to remedies in general, to judicial and administrative proceedings, including redress and remedy. So these are the three fundamental access rights, and it's further fleshed out in the Knox principles, what we call the Knox principles, which was written by the Special Rapporteur John Knox on the Framework Principles on Human Rights in the Environment, which provides for the clear obligations of states to protect the environment in the context of human rights. So in these principles, Special Rapporteur Knox sketches out the principles of access to environmental information and the need for states to facilitate further public participation in decision-making and also access to effective remedies. Now, the Principle 10 and the Knox principles are further explained and in the Bali guidelines for the development of national legislation and environmental access rights. Now, this was spearheaded by UNEP and provides for 26 non-voluntary recommendations on how national governments could go about in implementing these access rights in their respective jurisdictions. To give a context then to how it relates to biodiversity and sustainable development, I'd like to zero in on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So the environmental rights and necessarily access rights are included in the goals, contributes to the goals of primarily SDG 16, which hopes to ensure the access to justice, and there are effective and strong institutions to provide justice. So it's in one target in 16.10, it says that it should ensure that public access to information and protect and fundamental freedoms should be protected in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. Now, this relates to the other biodiversity conservation provisions of the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 15, which envisions some conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of life on land in line with obligations under international agreements. And this also relates to the SDG 14, which is life below water, which pushes for the sustainable management and conservation of our seas and oceans. And this is not highlighted too much in access rights, but in our paper, we would like to give a closer look on how it applies to the marine context as well. This is important because according to the Asia-Pacific data of the UN Economic and Social Commission in Asia-Pacific, life below water has regressed the most. If you see the slide, regressed the most among all the SDGs. So among the international conventions, the CBD has provisions on public participation, especially on projects that may have potential adverse impacts on biodiversity. So they must have public participation, meaningful public participation. And there's also the need for exchange of information for data that may arise, that may affect biodiversity. And relating to the oceans, the Law of the Sea Convention also provides that available information and data shall be exchanged through competent international organizations with participation of all state parties. So these focus on the biodiversity aspects on land and water. And what we envision for Southeast Asia is to have also another regional agreement that focuses on this region and has these three fundamental access rights, including the enabling environment and protection for environmental and human rights defenders, and the recognition of the right to a healthy environment as well. So this stems from other examples from other regional instruments. The first one is in Europe and beyond on the Aarhus Convention, which enshrines the three fundamental access rights. But also we would like to take stock from the example of the Escazú Agreement, which just took into went into force this year in May. That's focused on Latin America and the Caribbean, which guarantees also a safe and enabling environment for environmental and human rights defenders so that they are able to act free from threat and restriction and insecurity. And it also guarantees the right, recognizes the right for every person to live in a healthy environment. And the key takeaway here is that through these regional agreements, the parties, state parties, must take necessary legislative, regulatory, as well as proper enforcement measures to ensure that these access rights, fundamental access rights, are implemented in national jurisdictions. And with this, I turn over to Matthew for the other recommendations. Matthew?
Thank you very much indeed, Rocky. And so one of the things we were looking at in the context of ASEAN and protection of biodiversity was that there are some legal frameworks on biodiversity conservation in Southeast Asia and some ASEAN frameworks that actually identify key rights. So for example, under Article 5 of the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, there is a particular reference to the need for effective and enforceable remedies. Article 28 of that also includes a reference to a safe and healthy environment, which are all part of those Escazú agreements. There's a challenge in terms of the justiciability of the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, but it's something that can be looked at within the context of developing some sort of regional agreement on access rights. The ASEAN Charter is quite clear on its obligations to protect and preserve and promote a sustainable development for the people of ASEAN. We have seen, however, that that's been a challenge, in particular this year with the recent coup in Myanmar and how ASEAN responds to those threats to its very charter and very vision. There are also other hard law instruments in ASEAN, the Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, and many other particular agreements relating to certain aspects of non-environmental matters. There is the ASEAN Agreement on the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources from 1984, but that hadn't come into effect, and it's something that maybe needs to be looked at in the context of negotiations and developments of the COP on biodiversity and the Paris Agreement, and indeed the Oceans Conference that are coming up. There's also sub-regional agreements such as the ASEAN, the Agreement on the Cooperation for the Sustainable Development of the Mekong River Basin that established the Mekong River Commission and a process looking at transboundary environmental impact assessments in the context of developments that might affect the Mekong. That's also had significant challenges. These are challenges that relate also to the consideration of the future and what might happen in the future. Next slide, thanks Rocky. And so in terms of those challenges, and I think the Mekong River Agreement highlights some of those important challenges in terms of participation rights, where you have an agreement that had a prior notification, a prior consultation and approval process that was meant to impact or meant to be undertaken prior to any decisions for mainstream dams. But in both cases, we've seen all of those transboundary environmental impact assessment notifications and consultations occur after the Lao government has approved of both the Zaburi Dam and the Pak Beng Dam, which shows that even if you have certain agreements in place, you have to make them enforceable and justiciable. So one of the things we've also looked at, and it's probably very important for consideration both with the Biodiversity Convention COP coming up and for those involved in the negotiations on the treaty about biodiversity beyond natural jurisdictions, is how you can apply terrestrial environmental governance management operations to the marine environment, and vice versa. One of the great problems that we have is to acknowledge that dynamic and interconnected properties of the ocean and land ecosystems do require this greater linkage in the legal framework. So issues of environmental impact assessment, strategic environmental assessment, and cumulative impact assessment, which have been arisen and were discussed, in fact, earlier today, have been developed in the terrestrial and the marine, the coastal environment. But are they really applicable in many instances in the oceans environment, and in particular in areas beyond national jurisdiction? One of the issues about environmental impact assessment is that it's conducted by the proponent. But if the proponent is a government that's sponsoring a particular development, and the proponent is also the decision maker to whether approve that, that would be inconsistent under EIA law. And the question also of EIA, which requires fundamental public participation, access to information, and application of a number of key principles of environmental law, such as the precautionary principle, principle of intergenerational equity, the polluter pays principle. These are things that are very difficult to translate into an ocean governance environment. But one of the things we focus on is the importance of ensuring that we do have adequate access to information and public participation, however that is possibly able to be done in an oceans governance regime. And above all, the transparency and availability of information is critical to all good decision makings. It must also be remembered that in 1992, with Rio Declaration, Principle 10 focused on information in government hands. And since the development over that last 30 years of the internet and the World Wide Web, those things have shown that there is significant opportunities for information to be constantly made available. So as a constant requirement to ensure that environmental information is made available, so people don't have to ask for it, it's provided as a requirement. But more importantly, we have to extend that obligation to corporations. Often the corporations hold significant amounts of environmental information that they don't share with government, or they seek to share with it under commercial and confidence arrangements. These must be stopped, these must be overturned, and information must be provided on which public, community, and the government can make important decisions about environmental impacts and environmental actions. Next slide, please, Rocky. And so I just wanted to conclude in the final slide, so go one further, if that's okay, that just the idea that we're exploring in terms of advancing an Escazú style agreement on access rights in ASEAN, which could also apply in the Pacific or even South Asia, is the importance of these 5 key elements: the access to remedies, questions of establishing green courts and procedures for environmental cases, access to information, again, making sure that this is both for corporate and government as well, the importance of free prior informed consent for Indigenous communities, but may be applicable to all decisions made affecting oceans governance when you have broader issues of people who may be affected, because oceans governance affects most of the populations of the world rather than any specific national population. Again, it's the importance of creating these effective platforms for public participation. How those can be done in an oceans environment is clearly a challenge. But above all, we say that there must be guarantees of a safe, healthy environment, which must include a safe, healthy oceans. It must include a safe, healthy coastal environment, and it must protect those particular areas of biodiversity that are vital to the continuation of the biodiversity of oceans and coastal areas such as seagrasses and coral reefs. No destruction of those should be, continents are allowed, including mangrove forest. And finally, the recognition of a right to a healthy environment. In the context of the biodiversity negotiations happening this year, the ocean discussions happening this year, and indeed in the Paris Agreement, we must start to require these international conferences, these international agreements, to recognise that right to a healthy environment and to make it justiciable in national courts and whatever international forum are set up to ensure that there is effective access to remedies. thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this today.
Thanks so much, Rocky and Matthew.
Thank you.
Correspondingly, the Deputy Director and Director of the Asian Research Institute on Environmental Law, and somehow managed in just a few minutes to cover such a complex web, not only of the issues, but of the legal regimes that are related to it. So thank you very much for setting that up. I think I might go to one burning question, because we do already have that in our Q&A. So the question comes from Ganesan Vetia, and to what extent can BBNJ be implemented in the South China Sea, where there are overlapping claims and the so-called COC yet to have been materialized? And adds a comment, what's ASEAN's stand on this solidarity? Who would like to respond to that?
Well, if I could start, I'm not familiar with the particularities of the BBNJ as applied to South China Sea, but I believe the most parts of the South China Sea are within national jurisdictions. If you follow the Law of the Sea Convention, there's only a small sliver that would be covered by these areas, would be considered as an area beyond national jurisdiction. So in case of these areas, there must be, following from the mandates from the Law of the Sea Convention, there must be a duty to protect, conserve, and rehabilitate these environments, even if it's areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the upcoming treaty or agreement, the implementing agreement of the Law of the Sea Convention, would surely help in the management of these resources underwater in the deep seabed. So I have yet to see the exact specific provisions for this, but this would surely help if there would be a legal framework that would cover this. So it's not just in the Pacific or in large swaths of the oceans, but this could also help in these areas which are subject of a lot of controversies. Now, how the COC, the Code of Conduct, could help, we have yet to see how that could help in this framework.
Excellent. Thank you, Rocky. And just to build on Matthew's point of now we have the World Wide Web, he's very kindly provided in the chat box a link to a report related to this article, and very much looking forward to continuing this discussion with other panelists later on. But for now, moving to Dr. Deva Prasad from the Indian Institute of Management with the topic Indian Sui Generis Agrobiodiversity Legal Framework, Lessons for an Inclusive Global Model. Deva, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Mitchell. Starting with the topic, I'm taking a complete Indian perspective while looking at this topic. So just mentioning that upfront, so that many of the aspects of comparative perspectives are not yet included into the research work. So here I'm trying to look at how India has attempted to develop a legislative framework, indigenously sui generis legislative framework to look at agrobiodiversity and some gaps in it, and how it could be improved, and that could be a possible way to look at a framework for the global South and a global governance of agrobiodiversity. It could be a bit slightly ambitious approach, but I hope a co-panelist and the attendees would help me to narrow it down in case I'm slightly too ambitious on this. Right. So one of the significant issues faced the Indian context is of the diversity in agriculture from indigenous practice perspective and resource perspective as such. So how India could protect that, or how India could ensure the resources are protected and regulated, is a concern which India tried to attempt to solve through a legislative mechanism. That's where India came out with the sui generis mechanism of evolving a law called as Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act. This was legislated in 2001. Interestingly, this legislation was put in place much before India has adopted a domestic framework for biological diversity, which came up in 2002. So 1 year before that, we have this legislation of Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act. To quickly look at some of the salient features of this legislation, it actually obviously came into picture due to the push from the TRIPS agreement requirement of having a specific domestic legal framework for plant variety protection. Since India didn't want to go to protect it under the patent or patent law, what India did was to have a specific legislative framework as we just mentioned about the plant variety protection and farmers' rights legislation. This farmers' rights legislation is an interesting legislation from the perspective of trying to balance the interests of both the seed producers, breeders, as well as that of the farmers, because it says that farmers, I'm just highlighting one of the important provisions here, which says that farmers have vested with the rights to save the seeds and resources. They can reuse it, they can exchange it, and they can resow it, and they can even sell the produce as such. There is no major restriction coming into picture upon the farmers here in the context of how they can actually access the seed resources and how indigenous varieties could be further protected as such. But the only restriction that come into picture here is that for those of the registered varieties under the legislation, they cannot actually sell it. The farmers cannot sell it under any the branded seeds under the legislation or protected seeds under the legislation cannot be sold by the farmers as such. So theoretically speaking, and the literature available, academic literature available, also point towards the fact that yes, it is a very balanced attempt to provide a framework to protect the agriculture biodiversity in Indian context. Now, having mentioned that, there is certain concerns that may arise because certain of the civil society organizations have done some reports on how the farmers have felt about the legislation, how they felt this legislation have benefited them. That is where I think we can actually see that there is some gap already existing due to the fact that this legislation is slightly more bureaucratic. It has a top-down approach of having a separate authority being created, which will actually try to provide whether the protection of what you could call as the seeds can be registered under this law or not. So mostly it is breeders and seed producers who have taken the benefit of the legislation. Farmers find it too bureaucratically burdensome for them to go and get this protection under the legislation. That is one of the important points which need to be looked into. And from a biodiversity perspective, conservation of biodiversity is not too much a focus of the legislation, and that is where we need to see that whether the law has incentivized the conservation of indigenous biodiversity, of the rich biodiversity seeds and the plant varieties India has. That is where we need to look at this question of how to plug this gap, how the issue of capacity building for agri-biodiversity protection can be brought into picture. Can the farmers' rights be better equipped? Can they equip much more better to be autonomous in this context? Because farmers' rights obviously appear in the theoretically very well mentioned in the legislation, but how it can be translated into a practical approach in the law and policy perspective. So one of the attempts which I try to push across in this paper is to see that yes, one aspect which has been neglected usually in many of the developing countries or global south is the existence of a community seed bank. This has been a practice which most of the countries has have been following, that they have a clear community seed bank existing in an informal sector. Obviously, now the requirement is that the community seed bank, which is a bottom-up approach or collective of farmers coming together or the community coming together to exchange seed or preserve the seed varieties or biodiversity varieties as such, that can be plugged into, or that can be brought into a legal framework in a better manner. That is the way in which I think India could be giving a better approach to the farmers' rights and agro-biodiversity protection. That could also be a global model, at least for the global south, to follow in this particular context. So here, what I'll just quickly run through is that at present, there has been the community seed banks existing, mostly through civil society organizations or farmers collectives, informally providing support to it. But still, we need to integrate it into a mainstream legislative framework. So the farmers' rights legislation, which I talked about, that along with a main legislation for biodiversity, which we have in India, there's a Biological Diversity Act, which has been enacted pursuant to the International Convention. That is where integrating the seed banks, community seed bank concept into these two legislation would be a way forward. Integrating it in these two legislations obviously would be helpful because of the fact that Biological Diversity Act provides a three-tier mechanism of biological governance and biodiversity governance in India. One at the national level, state level, and the local governance level. That is where I think community seed bank can function. The local governance level or the village community level, that is where the biological seed bank concept, if is embedded in the Biological Diversity Act, they can actually help to map the entire biological diversity resources in the agriculture sector, one. And this could be an important step in the first regard, a starting point in this regard of ensuring that there is enough of the agriculture biodiversity data bank, or the resources are at least collated in the Indian context. Now, along with this, important point which community seed banks can function is that they could help the farmers and the farming community or the community knowledge to be translated into plant variety protection by registering with the authority in the Plant Variety Protection Act. Since they have been empowered to do that, they have enough legitimacy to do so, and they can be doing it in case the CSBs or community seed banks are brought into the mainstream. Also, they can be provided the major role in negotiating with seed producing companies or with breeders regarding access and benefit sharing rights. At this present point, access and benefit sharing rights, I'm sure that Professor Stelina will mention it in more detail, but I'm sure this is a part where access and benefit sharing in India, the public participation or the bottom-up approach is not at all visible in the access and benefit sharing mechanism. The translation of Nagoya into India has not been much effective, especially from empowering the bottom-up approach aspect. So that is something which could be done, in my view, with the help of community seed bank being empowered in a clear manner, and they can actually also be given the power to look at negotiate on behalf of the community and the farmers regarding access and benefit sharing. Also, whether to look at monetary or non-monetary resources could be looked at by the community seed banks as such. So that's the main point which I would like to just end with. So integrating this community seed bank concept into the Biological Diversity Act, as well as the Plant Variety Protection and Farmers' Rights Act, would be much beneficial for a bottom-up approach of agro-biodiversity protection in Indian context. This would also be helpful for various other countries like Nepal, Ethiopia, and other developing countries where community seed bank concept is also being much prevalently being used. And a country like India pushing forward a comprehensive framework in this context, using biodiversity legislation and farmers' rights legislation together, would provide an impetus for other global south, as well as maybe a global model for trying to protect agrobiodiversity concept. So with this, I would like to end my presentation. Thanks to the panelists and the listeners. Thanks. I will also be happy to look at any questions coming up in this context. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Deva. And already seeing so many links across the two presentations that we've seen so far in terms of, yes, you can have substantial rights, but if there's this huge bureaucratic and procedural barriers to achieving them, then how do we do it? And you provided a possible way forward as well. Thank you very much. And again, seeing that clear link to what we're about to, as you alluded to as well, the clear link to what Dr. Stellina Joly is now going to talk about. Dr. Stellina Joly from the South Asian University on access and benefit sharing and protection of traditional knowledge, a legal analysis of the Indian biodiversity regime. Stellina.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Just let me share the screen. I hope my screen is visible to all.
Yes, visible. Maybe you want to put it on slide. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. Similar to Professor Deva Prasad, my focus of presentation is on Indian jurisdiction. I'll be if you remember the Deva's presentation, he has highlighted a particular fact that the implementation of Nagoya Protocol in India has not followed typically a bottom-up approach and empowerment of community, which is one of the mandate of the Nagoya Protocol. So my focus of the presentation is on the implementation of ABS mechanism in India with a focus on the traditional knowledge and indigenous communities. But before starting with the India, I felt it is important for me to contextualize the Nagoya Protocol and India's relationship with the entire biodiversity mechanism. So I'll just briefly, catalog couple of issues associated with the Nagoya Protocol and then go on discussing the India's biodiversity regime. So if you look at the ABS mechanism, I believe this is one of the most important concepts of the 21st century. This is Nagoya Protocol not only regulates the transnational bioprospecting, but in my opinion, it also brings in or implements or attempts to implement the broader notion of environmental protection, which integrates or which bring in the pluralistic concept of justice. So if you analyze the Nagoya Protocol, it is an embodiment of the pluralistic notion of justice. But at the same time, along with the CBD, it weaves together the justice aspect and also the ABS act as a foundation for the conservation or sustainable management of biodiversity resources. So in a way, it provides a comprehensive notion of environmental protection. So analyzing the core of Nagoya Protocol and contextualizing it in the context of my presentation, 2 points are important. The Nagoya Protocol essentially provides for a prior informed consent with regard to access to genetical resources and traditional knowledge. And it also prescribes that any utilization of the traditional knowledge has to be followed by a benefit sharing mechanism. Two aspects. One, with regard to access to genetical resources or traditional knowledge, there has to be a kind of an autonomy or a prior informed consent of the parties. Second, any utilization of the traditional knowledge has to be followed by a fair and equitable benefit sharing mechanism. So with regard to the traditional knowledge and indigenous community rights, so in other words, you can also look at the Nagoya Protocol as a mechanism. Almost for the first time at the international level, certain substantive rights has been provided to indigenous communities, and in a way has elevated these indigenous communities to be a subject of international law, wherein they could enter into a contract, agreement, or they are in a position to even to see that agreements of fair and benefit sharing mechanism has been implemented. So these are the provisions which is of special pertinent to the traditional knowledge under the protocol. To begin with, the traditional knowledge as a term has not been defined by the Nagoya Protocol. Definitely, it's a very difficult term to define, but on a general parlance, we can say that traditional knowledge is any kind of a knowledge system which has been shared and developed or evolved by the indigenous or a local communities in a cultural context, embodying a traditional method of lifestyle. So further an analysis of the Nagoya Protocol reveals that Article 5 talks about benefit sharing. And here this particular provision is important. Even if there is no access mechanism, any kind of a utilization of the traditional knowledge has to be followed by the benefit sharing. So it's a kind of a obligatory or a mandatory benefit sharing whenever there is a utilization of a traditional knowledge. Second, Article 7 of the Nagoya Protocol talks of access to traditional knowledge based on the prior informed consent of the indigenous community. Further, Article 12 and 16 talks of taking into account the community laws, customary laws, or developing a model protocols. These are all very, very important substantive as well as procedural aspects while implementing the protocol. Now coming to the Indian context. India was in any kind of an environmental negotiations, India has always spearheaded the Global South movement. And with regard to the biodiversity, India's engagement was much more vociferous because this was also the time, if you remember, the WTO and TRIPS negotiations was coming to an end, and India was already seeing a fleet of biopiracy issue. So India has definitely spearheaded the Global South movement. And legalistically, since India follows a dualist approach, the international obligations do not automatically become part of India's domestic obligations. So in 2002, in order to implement the conventions on a biological diversity obligation, the Indian government enacted the Biodiversity Act. This particular act established a multi-tier structure of the ABS and the biodiversity regime with the National Biodiversity Authority at the central level. It is also followed by the State Biodiversity Authority at the different states, and also supplemented by the biodiversity management committees at the local level. But if you really go into the implementation aspect, the establishment of a biological management committee at the local level has not been effective. And in most of the cases, even today, it has not even been constituted. After the Nagoya Protocol, the Biodiversity Act has not been exactly amended, but it has been supplemented by the rules which has been formed in 2014 regarding the access to biological resources. So the Biodiversity Act 2002 supplemented by the the access benefit sharing rules of 2014 governs the India's biodiversity or access and benefit sharing regime. So this analysis of the legislative provisions brings forth certain provisions where Indian legal provisions is in a way conflict or deviate from the objective and spirit of the Nagoya Protocol. This is since my focus is on the traditional knowledge, I'll context the discrepancy or the deviations of the Indian legal positions from the Nagoya Protocol. If you look at the Nagoya Protocol, you can see even a controlled search provisions of the Nagoya Protocol reveals numerous references to the indigenous and traditional communities, the local communities. But the Biological Diversity Act of India is very, very interesting. It refrains from using the word indigenous or a local community for the traditional knowledge honor. Instead, it adopts in the government terms, it adopts a very broader term, benefit claimers, right? And the act definitely defines who qualifies as a benefit claimers. So it says that they could be conservers of the biological resources, their byproducts, creators, and holders of knowledge and information relating to the use of biological innovations and practices associated with you. So what could be the implications of not using the indigenous and local community for the traditional knowledge and instead of using it as a benefit claimers? Two, It could be, in the case of Nagoya Protocol, it's normally a community rights. Here, even an individual can qualify as a benefit claimer. Second, again, if you look at the definitions of the benefit claimer, they do not use the word traditional knowledge. The definition only uses the word knowledge, indicating that any kind of a knowledge associated with the biological resources by an individual, it need not be a traditional embodiment of way of life. So it is in any kind of a knowledge, even if it is claimed to by an individual, who could be. So that definitely can be considered as a very positive and sometimes the broader. But what is the Indian government's legal problem with regard to the use of indigenous or local community? It has not exactly, in the context of only the biological diversity, it is in the larger picture of India's engagement with the international negotiations, even with regard to the indigenous rights. India has traditionally and consistently been taking a position at the international level, even at the UN declarations on the indigenous rights. Even though India is a party to it, it has very, very categorically claimed that India do not have any indigenous population. So for the official document, Indian government considers the entire population of India as part of the indigenous and local communities. I do not understand that, how the Indian government can justify, but this has been the consistent position of the Indian government, that India do not have any indigenous. So this particular fear of the categorizing the indigenous communities comes from the India's fear of that if they recognize the indigenous communities, they may be required to take modifications in the legal structure, specifically with regard to autonomy and self-determination. So it is this particular fear. So that particular fear, you can see it has percolated to the Biological Diversity Act, which refrains from using the indigenous and local communities. So that itself, you can see it as a dilution of the Nagoya Protocol provisions. So how does the implementation of the access and benefit sharing identify the benefit claimers? So looking at the definitions, but there are certain other kind of domestic legal provisions which could be of help in terms of identifying the benefit claimers. Prominent among them is the Forest Rights Act, which has been passed in 2006. This particular act has been passed, specifically the object and the preamble of the act specifically mentioned that this act has been passed in order to rectify the historical injustice meted out to the scheduled tribes and other forest dwelling community. So the indigenous communities can be closely associated with the forest dwellers or the scheduled tribes community. So that particular act also talks about access to biological diversity rights. So I think even though the Indian Act has talked about only benefit claimers, if you have a if you incorporate and read in together as a synergy mechanism both the acts, I think the rights of the indigenous communities can be accounted, but that can only take place if this particular act is read along with the provisions of the Forest Rights Act. But that, if you look at the implementation, that has not always taken place. Second aspect is that Nagoya Protocol specifically talks about the prior informed consent of the indigenous community, especially with regard to access. But as Deva Prasad said, that Indian biodiversity regime talks about a top-down approach where most of the authority is concentrated at the National Biodiversity Authority. So India contemplates benefit sharing only in situations where an access is taken. So this I consider is clearly against the spirit of Article 5 of 5.5 of the Nagoya Protocol, which envisages in every case where a traditional knowledge is utilized, it is followed by a benefit sharing. So in any situation, if there is no access and benefit sharing mechanism or a prior informed consent is not taken, then there is no obligation to have a benefit sharing agreement as per the Indian legislations. And the provisions of the Biodiversity Act further goes on to prove these conditions. For instance, Section 19 of the Indian Biodiversity Act says that when National Biodiversity Authority, The Act says that Section 3 and Section 19. Section 3 says that if anybody wants to have an access to biological resources, has to approach the National Biodiversity. So while granting the approval or decisions, National Biodiversity is required to make inquiries as it deems fit. So there is no mandatory obligations on the National Biodiversity Authority to consult or take the approval of the indigenous communities. So, further, if you look at Section 19, it says that while, if the National Biodiversity Authority, when they're going to reject the applications, they should mandatorily give a hearing to the person who is affected. Who is the person who is affected? The person who is applying for the access. So there is no mandatory obligation to hear the affected communities, which could be the traditional knowledge holders. So it's a kind of a top-down model where the empowerment or a participation of the community has really been neglected and diluted. And this particular approach of the Indian legislation is further visible if you look at other sections of the Biological Diversity Act, which says that the National Biodiversity Authority and the state biodiversity may consult the biodiversity management. So as I mentioned, Biological Management Committee, that is the committee at the local level. See, that is a mechanism where you can involve the indigenous and traditional communities. But even there, the consultation with them, first of all, in many places, they have not been even established. But even in the places where they have been established, so there is no mandatory requirement of a consultation. So in a way, you can see that in spite of all the decentralization and devolution of power, the Indian biodiversity regime do not believe in the utilization of these local bodies, which could be repositories and which could be one of the effective mechanism to articulate and empower the local communities. Further, if you look at the National Biodiversity Authority or state biodiversity authorities, there is no representatives or mandatory representation from the indigenous or local communities. It's mostly the experts, bureaucratic, or it is concerned, it's comprises of the state or other government officials. So these provisions very, very clearly says that with regard to the traditional knowledge, the Indian Biodiversity Act has a very, very diluted provisions. I will highlight two more concerns and then I'll wind up. The other provision is that, see, if you look at the India's traditional knowledge, a lot of traditional knowledge, we have a transboundary concept. I'll give you one example, which is a ABS cases, which has come into existence even before the conventions on a biological diversity. So there was a particular tribe in the western parts of India, the Kani, the tribe. So they had certain traditional knowledge regarding a particular herb, which provides immunity, stamina, and endurance. So as a domestic ABS mechanism, even before the Conventions on Biological Diversity Act came into existence, India had established through the certain initiative of the scientific community, there was an ABS mechanism because a medicine was developed out of this particular traditional knowledge and the benefit has been shared. But the fact is that this particular traditional knowledge do not only belong to that community, it is also shared by the communities in Sri Lanka. So there is a lot of, especially the geographical, the boundaries of the South Asia, there are many instances where the traditional knowledge is a transboundary in nature. So if you look at the Biological Diversity Act, it is silent as far as any mention of the transboundary cooperation or with regard to these transboundary situations, how the traditional knowledge can be shared or accessed. Similarly, the Nagoya Protocol provides a lot of momentum to empowerment of communities, and for that, they insist on developing the community protocols and also taking into account the customary laws. So even if I take the India's legal system also, the customary laws also is being recognized as given the place of a law. But if you look at the Biological Diversity Act, they're silent with regard to the involvement of the community, or even the development or implementation or the model, and even taking into account the customary laws of the community. For instance, if I take certain communities in India, especially if I take a particular state in Andhra Pradesh, they have a community which has a lot of traditional knowledge with regard to snake poisons or antidote to that. But their concept and belief is that that particular knowledge will not be shared to the general public, but it will be only shared with the kith and kin. So there are definitely the concerns which arise whether such the customary laws has to be preserved or respected, but at least it has to be taken into account. There has to be a dialogue. So if you look at the Indian Biological Diversity Act, I find a very, very diluted provisions with regard to the traditional and indigenous communities. And we have in India is one community, I think, which has one of the largest number of indigenous population in the world, even though the government of India do not recognize. So I think that situation really requires a lot of dialogue and maybe an activism on the part of civil societies to rectify this. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Selina. That was fascinating in terms of, you know, how the language in its definition in the domestic context has in so many ways not lived up to the Nagoya Protocol, and then also seeing these links between both your presentation and Deva's presentation, but also that of Rocky and Matthew in terms of the national government level capture of what's supposed to be that bottom-up level processes. And I'm seeing this a comment in the Q&A from Kath Wallace saying very often states deserve criticism, and also highlighting the need to move beyond immediate harms to look at system drivers, values, which you so clearly brought out in terms of that issue of pluralism and institutional arrangements that allow environmental harm. So I won't pose, there's no burning question for you at the moment. I'll move on to the next panel now. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And what I'm also seeing is the link between Stelina's presentation and highlighting how the Indian government seeks to define what indigenous peoples are, a very similar position taken by the Chinese government in negotiations. And we do move to now to three presenters from Shanghai Ocean University, looking not at the overlooked issue of perhaps the definition of indigenous people, but the overlooked issue of the oceans and looking at that interconnection in the oceans context. So we have Fanting Lin, Professor Tang Yi, and Dr. Zhang Yanxue Dan, who will be talking to us about valuation of genetic resources on aquatic species, a conceptual perspective. Welcome.
Thank you, Michelle.
Did you have, oh, good.
See my screen.
Great.
And good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Fan Jinlin from Shanghai Ocean University. It's a great honor to be here, thanks to the host. And I will represent all authors to make presentation, but all authors are available to answer questions and at Q&A and via email. Today, I will talk something about valuation of genetic resources on active species from a conceptual perspective. And the presentation includes these 4 parts. At first, let's begin at the background. The genetic resources have received extensive attention from international conventions and organizations such as CBD, Nagoya Protocol, BBNJ, and the FAO. But there is no clear definition of GIS due to their different management goals. And there are still some disagreements about the concept of genetic resources, which makes it more difficult to understand GIS. And the essence of these controversies is the disagreement over the benefits generated by the use of GRAS. So valuation of GRAS is essential for a better understanding of this concept. And this page shows some controversies about GRAS.
Tingling, you're still there. We can't hear you anymore. We can see your slides, but we can't hear you. Can you hear us? Perhaps try talking so we know if you can hear us or not, or type in the chat box. We'll try and fix this. There's a suggestion from one of our audience members that perhaps if you're all on the same Wi-Fi, it might be affecting the bandwidth.
Okay, hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Share.
you.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Maybe I continue
Thank you.
and let her to readjust to restart. Maybe it can work. Sorry for that. Sorry for that. I'll share a screen. 1 minute. Yeah. Can you see it?
No. Yes. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Okay. I'll try to. Sorry. So, is that okay?
Perhaps if you put it on presentation mode.
Okay. No. Unit. How is it?
Right. Yep. That's good.
Great. Okay. So we are just talking about the background. We have why we want to develop these ideas, this concept, because we find disagreements on the concepts on the GRAS, and we believe that disagreement. One of the main reasons because we don't know what is to be shared, what's the benefits. So that's the reason we come from the valuation of the GRS and AS, and we think it's important to understand this concept. So that's a big background. And we find disagreement on the definition of DSI as mentioned, I think yesterday, and also whether the derivative belongs to the genetic resources, or does DSI belong to the genetic resources? And we find different, like the agreements also have different definition actually. For example, in the Nagoya Protocol and the draft of the third meeting of BBNJ, they have different understanding whether the derivatives and the DSI belongs to the GRAS. So that comes to our research design. Thus, we try to give a definition by studying all the literatures, and also we use try to use a theory, look into the theory of the natural resources as the basis for investigation, and also explore the valuation connotations. And so that's the and the method is based is many library-based studies, and reviewed and analyzed the relevant studies on the value of the natural resources, and read relevant studies, documents, reports related to how to define the value of genetic resources and GRAS, and also the empirical data on how the GRS applied used from a large number of documents and articles. And so what is value? Sorry. And we use utility theory as a theory of value as a basis for our evaluation. And so this article takes this as the presumption. You can see that as the starting point to see what it is consists of. And so the natural resources, we look at the theory of the natural resources, and find that natural resources refer to the natural or close to natural products that belongs to the obtained from nature to meet the needs and design and results of human activities. And we find different theories, and basically they have and by looking at these articles, finally we decided to use the TEV because it's more commonly used in the practice to evaluate the value of the natural resources. And I find this structure it classifies the value as use value and non-use value. And maybe you are all of you are also familiar with this structure, and it's direct use value, indirect and option, and heritage value and existence value. And we believe based on this structure, we believe that GRAS is like a part of, firstly, we think it's a part of natural resources, but it does not belong to the category of the traditionally we think traditionally the natural resources. So it considers the natural resources from a very different perspective, from a genetic perspective. So we believe the TEV framework may not be able to explain the value of natural resources from this genetic level. So that's the reason it's necessary for us to examine the TEV framework. Based on the TEV framework, and we have these parameters. So we believe that genetic level is at the base for the whole biodiversity system. And so that's a result. One of the result we find the value classification and connotation of the GRAS can be put into different categories. It includes commercial development value, genetic breeding value. It's used for the aquaculture, and also cultural value, the management value, ecological value, and it has also option value. And we give the definition for each one. And I will go one by one. Commercial development value, which checks on like I said before, that we check some documents and empirical evidence of what is going on, what is from science papers or something, and see how it is used. And they are used as raw materials first. So I think medicine and health products, cosmetics, and marine biological pesticides, and also the genetic breeding value. They are used for the the materials and the information are being used for the genetic breeding. And also the cultural value, traditional knowledge. We talk a lot about traditional knowledge, GRAS. And the management of value, it means that we use this genetic information for the monitoring, evaluation, and management of species. Like we trace the species for a specific species and use that information to get some, to manage the species in the ocean. And the second one is the conserve and the genetic materials, and also the materials and information are used to to preserve the genetic material, and later maybe restore it or rebuild it. If some scholar propose that, we know there are some controversies here. Okay. And also ecological values, we think the parameters we think is a basis to support a stable aquatic communities and aquatic ecosystems. So it's farm-based and to the ecosystem diversity. And the option value, we think it's also an option. The optional value also comes from uncertainty of the we don't know, we may use it in the future. So it's an option value. So we think that the genetic generally we get a temporary conclusion. That's the genetic resources, it has added a lot to the part a bit on the TV model. We believe it adds a lot to the use value, this part. But what about the non-use value? I mean, the heritage value here, it means the value to leave to the next generation. We didn't come to that part so far. And we think maybe what part, what genetic resources, maybe we can define more values in that part. So temporary conclusion is that the concept maybe of GRAS may be further clarified by investigation this value composition, the composition of values, and it will add to the natural resources, what we know. And the value of the GRAS is categorized use this TEV framework. This may set foundation, set basis for valuation next step. And we think valuation is fundamental for to establishing the benefit sharing mechanisms, maybe for the legal purpose and for legal documents later. And the future work, this is the first step. We just try to find the use value, and we will have more work maybe for next level. So that's it. Some reference. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan, and thank you for filling in. It was excellent teamwork there, and really really interesting way of wrapping up the conversations we've had so far, including in that different idea of what constitutes value, what are different ways in which we can value nature, economic means or other means. I'll welcome all of our audience to either put your question in the chat box or in the Q&A. But while we're waiting, I've got a question for all of our panelists. Feel free to answer or not answer, just put your hand up who would like to go first. And as a theme I see being channeled through each of these issues, and in some ways I alluded to earlier, is how do we create, considering the political challenges, how do we create better mechanisms which facilitate issues of access to justice, whether that be procedural or substantive issues? How do we facilitate what is clearly recognized as a very important issue of that bottom-up management when the power comes from these structures far above those of the local indigenous communities? So question to any of our panelists, feel free to respond.
So Michelle, maybe, I mean, one thing I always think is very important is we have to completely recognize those rights. So rights under the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that contains issues about free, prior, informed consent. And then you must then have that implemented at national law, and you must make people liable for their failures to comply with that. People often say, you know, we don't need more law on environment, but we do need more implementation of those laws. And I think in this context, and the India experience has been highlighted, that the law, you know, might exist in a particular way, but more importantly, we have to implement what is already there. And that, again, may require litigation, which is unfortunate and costly, but it may also require us to think about obligations for directors, companies to ensure compliance, because there are always particular actors who are not complying with their legal obligations under environmental law. And that's what often causes the breaches. Not always, but often.
Excellent. And I really like how you bring out that point of we're no longer in a world of state-based actors. Thankfully, the recognition that that's not the situation anymore, but importantly, how do we make sure that huge global actors are held accountable on the one hand and local actors do have a voice on the other? Thanks, Matthew. Any of our other panelists like to respond?
Yeah, I just want to supplement Matthew, but Michelle, I think you have raised 100 million questions, which is not easy to answer. How do you implement? So I look at it, from a multiple perspective. So I think whether it is international law or a national law, there is a lot of power dynamics. So even if I say the UN DRIP, the Indigenous Convention is the best one, but we all know that ultimately all international laws are a compromise. So I think there is a kind of the voices of a lot of unheard nations or unheard communities, even at that international level. So I think there, it's not just that, okay, international law is the ideal solution that can be implemented. So I think we need to pay enough attention to the 12 scholars are, for decades, they have been talking about that global south, not only just global south, I think within global south or between global south or it's, I think, a lot of permutation combination. Secondly, I think at the national level, so the flexibilities, like if you look at Nagoya Protocol, I can't say that Indian legal position is in directly conflict with Nagoya, because Nagoya provides that kind of a flexibility or the soft language which uses may, shall, like, okay, it is, so, China can implement it in a different manner, Bhutan or India can implement that. So yes, there is always a flexibility or attached to the domestic system. But if you look at the implementation at, I think, domestic level, it all will finally boils down to how active and robust a civil society or a legal educations, I think the institutions are. So the most of the, if I take the Indian context, a lot of legal reforms, especially right of information, has completely come out of a larger mass social movement led by. So even India has a very robust history of environmental justice movement. So I think a lot of awareness is finally will percolate. How does the civil society, whether can they operate in an independent manner, and how well they will be able to articulate. And we can't, I think, ignore the role of, I think, transnational cooperation. I think that's where international community itself has failed to regulate their activity. I think in terms of that connection between transnational and environmental harm, if something really can be done in a legal manner, there will be a lot of active role for the communities. And third, I think institutions has a major role to play. I'll speak from again in the Indian context, with all the problems associated with Indian judiciary. To a great extent, Indian judiciary has been very proactive in terms of various environmental rights. I'll just give you one cases with regard to mining. It is known as the Vedanta mining case. So Vedanta as an entity was involved in the mining, which is a tradition, which is occupied by an indigenous communities who had a spiritual association with this particular forest area. So despite the fact that Indian legislation do not talk about a free informed consent, even the term consultation was interpreted as meaning that mining can take place only with the consent of the indigenous community. So in that particular case, a new dimension or interpretation to the sustainable development was given in the context of recognizing the spiritual connection the indigenous communities have. So as a result, an environmental referendum was held. All the Gram Sabhas and communities rejected the mining. So I think institutions can definitely play a very active role in elevating and empowering the community. Thank you.
Thanks, Stelina. That was so comprehensive in terms of, I like your reframing of the local level having power in themselves, and then linking that to the transnational, then bringing them both together in such a vivid example. Thank you. Dan,
Sorry, jumping. Yeah, because Selena's words remind me that something happened about Chinese traditional medicine. So sometimes I think it's not about the law, legal, from my perspective, not about legal institution. Maybe it's all more about the power. The power is, for locals, it's too weak. If it's too weak, even there is a legal framework, sometimes you cannot use it well. And also not just the capacity, and also because you just cannot use the tool, and no one could. It's complicated normally for this part. And actually, I have one question. If I could ask Selena about the indigenous people, the rights to the genetic resources, because I'm very curious about. Do you think there? We know that there are rights for the indigenous people to access to the traditional knowledge based on the traditional knowledge. But is there a cultural perspective, cultural aspect for the genetic resources? Because it's a heritage, cultural heritage concerning the genetic resources for the indigenous people.
See, thank you. I can speak from the Indian perspective. Indian Act, if you look at it, they don't differentiate. Yes, the legally speaking, yes, indigenous communities can have a claim to the genetical resources. But if you look at the India's legal system, that possibility is very rare. There is a concept of sovereignty over the natural resources, and indigenous community has not been given a legal ownership that, so at the maximum, they have been given some kind of an assorted rights in terms of right of access or a right of utilization or a certain thing. So the ownership of, because when you talk about the genetical resources ownership, if indigenous community can claim that genetical, so that particular genetical resources has to be held by the indigenous community. So there is a dichotomy that I don't think that in the Indian legal system that could be possible. So practically speaking, the traditional communities will be benefited only in terms of their knowledge, not in terms of genetical resources. I think, Deva Prasad can maybe supplement.
Yes, quite true. As Professor Stelina mentioned, it's very true that the Indian context, it's many times not too proactively protected the community's rights. One of the interesting keys which actually comes into this regard is also called as Divya Pharmacy case, where the one of the local companies, as an Indian companies, try to access and medical resources of, I think it's Uttarakhand state, where the matter, when it went to the court, the company was telling that we don't have to actually look at ABS framework or access the benefit sharing framework if it's a domestic company. That was argument being raised in that particular case. Interestingly, court intervened and the High Court actually Uttarakhand High Court clearly said that no, you cannot actually say that access and benefit sharing rights is only applicable when a foreign company or a foreign entity is trying to access the Indian resource. Even within India, a company is trying to access the community resource and knowledge, you have to actually look at ABS aspect. So yes, I completely agree with Professor on that. Yes.
Thank you all. This is wonderful that the dialogue's happening among our panelists as well. I'm noticing that we've got 4 minutes left, and I'd like to bring in some of the questions from our audience. We've got one here from Judith Preston, which I think is probably directed to Deva and Stelina, but I think all panelists would likely have a perspective on it. Judith's question is, what is the role of community protocols in protecting Indigenous knowledges about biodiversity and reducing the risk of biopiracy? Who would like to take that one?
Yes,
okay, no,
I think Professor Stelina, you can go first. I'll just come later.
No, you can go first. I'll supplement you. No.
Right. So quickly to mention from the based on the topic which I was touching upon from agro-biodiversity perspective, one of the important point is the community protocols. Obviously, the biocultural concept do come into picture in Indian context also, but it is not yet evolved, or it's not yet being mentioned anywhere in the documents of at least the governmental reports, or even in the any of the rules or guidelines or in the legislation. We have not seen that getting document any of this community protocol or biocultural rights concept. So I think from Indian perspective, it is too early to look at it. So one of the ways in which we can look into is that actually to try to look at have some bottom-up approach, institutional mechanism frameworks to look at. So traditional knowledge, as Professor Stelina has also mentioned, some traditional knowledge concept, you need to have civil society or certain other institutional mechanisms, which is more of a collaborative governance mechanism can function. So that is also where I came and touched upon the concept of community seed bank also. So that is the only way I think a country like India can look at such a community protocol. It is very relevant, but not yet evolved as such. Yes.
Yeah, I'll just supplement Deva. I mean, he's absolutely right. We can't ignore the importance of community protocol in terms of even documenting and making them community empowered to negotiate at the international level in terms of an access mechanism. But the Indian Biodiversity Act and rules are completely silent with regard to the development of a community protocol. So somewhere the legal initiative has to be taken in terms of developing. See, this particular ignorance, I don't think that it is a accident. It could be a intentional omission. Firstly, because as I said, India do not recognize the indigenous communities, and we look at it as a benefit claimer, so even an individual also. So it's the primary importance is not the community rights. So that could be one of the reasons that the community protocols has been in a way avoided. And secondly, Indian legal system looks at this access and benefit sharing not in terms of rights, but I think it looks at it as a kind of a license which is granted by the government institutions for some time. So even though we use the word, it's not exactly been implemented in a right approach based system. So I think that becomes problematic. But this is not to say that if you look at the domestic institutions, there are enough mechanisms, especially there is something called Gram Sabha, which is at the local level of administration, and that Gram Sabha is a constitutional body. So Gram Sabha consists of, every elder in a village. If I take every elder who is an 18 years of is automatically a member of Gram Sabha. So that definitely has a constitutional body. So I think that body, if it can be strengthened, that Gram Sabha can be one of the most effective mechanism to empower the community or protect the biodiversity rights or develop community protocols. And even in terms of EIA, the Gram Sabha roles is, I think, underexplored. So In the Vedanta case, it is the Gram Sabha's roles which has been prominently highlighted by the Supreme Court. So I think if this interconnection between various legislations and institutions, that also can be utilized in the Indian context. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stelina, and to all of our panelists. We're very sadly right out of time, but I know I speak for all of our audience. It's been a fascinating panel. I've learned so much. Thank you all so very, very much for this really engaging discussion around, which has touched very complex issues from the international down to very, very grassroots level, and those interactions between them. So I know you can't see them, but everyone is joining me in giving you, each of you, a huge round of applause. Thank you very, very much. And do join us again at 7 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time for our final panel, which again links to Matthew's comment in terms of implementation. That panel will look specifically at enhancing enforcement, implementation, and compliance. And we will be extremely lucky to have that panel hosted by none other than Professor Lee Godden. So I look forward to seeing all of you in a few hours, and thank you again for this wonderful, wonderful panel. Thank you.